Hello YouTube, welcome back to my channel. So in today's tutorial we're going to go over type hints in Python. So if you don't know what type hints are, don't worry, this is what you are going to cover in these tutorials. Type hints are becoming very popular in Python. For example, let me just show you one of the documentations. So you can see recently the new frameworks, big frameworks in Python that are coming out recently are starting to use the type hints concept or theory in Python. So this type hint was introduced from Python 3.5. So for you to follow along with this video, you first need to have Python 3.5 or above installed. Have the latest version, Python 3.8 or Python 3.9. okay, so you can see this a new framework called FastAPI. It just came out recently, and you can, when reading the code, right, this is actually a very good framework. It's used by Microsoft, Uber, Netflix, and other companies. So if you scroll down to just the beginner page, right, to where they show you just how to start a simple API, you can see that it's actually a tool that is used to build API in Python. So you can see that it has a very weird kind of not Pythonic syntax. If you are a traditional Python guy, you probably not have come across these type notations and these kind of things in Python, right? So this is a new concept called the type hints in Python, and new frameworks are adopting the concept of type hints. So as a Python programmer, it's only in your best interest to stay ahead of the game and actually learn what type hints are, because if you move to frameworks like FastAPI, which and many more frameworks are going to adopt the same theory of type hints. So if you don't know it, you'll probably just be wondering what they do or what's going on, and you just be copying and pasting code without actually understanding what's going on. So in this tutorial, this is what this tutorial is meant to help you to do, to clear your understanding of type hints and to make you a pro in using type hints. So let's get started. Yeah, so now that we have a good understanding of type hints, why they're important, and why we should learn them, let's go ahead and actually check our requirements. So the first thing we need to do, we need to have Python 3.5 and above. So to check your Python version, you just have to say Python and then version. This will tell you the latest version of Python that is on your system. I have Python 3.8.3, and you should have Python 3.5 and above. So the best to be to start have a Python that is 8.3 and above to 8.9. That's the best. And then now that we have that, you also need to install a library called Mypy. So you just have to say pip install Mypy. So this will install for you the Mypy library. So the Mypy library is just going to use to check the types of your, to make sure that you follow the type that you have specified. So think of it like other programming languages like Java, C++, and other compiled languages that are statically typed. The type checking is done during compilation, right? So when the type checking is done, the compiler makes sure that the variable doesn't change, its type doesn't change throughout its whole lifetime. So if you have a variable that is of type int, then it can only store int throughout its whole lifetime within the program. So my Python doesn't have such a functionality. You can assign a string and then later assign a dictionary and then later assign a list to the same variable. So this Mypy will help you to check that before running your code, to tell you that if you have followed all the type hints and make sure that all the variables have maintained their type throughout their lifetime within your program before running your program using the Python interpreter. Again, Python is still a dynamically typed programming language, so even if you don't follow those type hints, nothing will happen. Your program will still run fine. But Mypy will help you to check those type hints to make sure that everything is as it should be. Okay, so now let's get started coding. So the first thing you need to understand is what is known as annotations. So how we do annotation, the syntax is, for example, you have an argument, a variable, and then a colon, and then space, and then the type. The type is the annotation. So right, so those are the variable annotations. So for example, I have a variable here called a and b. So a is going a colon space int and then equals to 30. So this is just the naming convention, like the syntax that you follow for proper annotation. So you just have to say the name of the variable and then followed by a colon and then a space and then the type, and then you can assign something to it. So a is going to be of type int and it's going to store the value 30, and then b is of type string str and it's going to store the value hello world. You can have c can be of type float, and then it can store a float value. So you can say maybe 7.999888. okay, so that's how we do the annotations. So make sure that just for convention you can keep even this semicolon there, I mean the dot double dot, you can keep it there, but the best convention is that you keep it right after the variable name. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go and look at type hints for functions. So let's move to this section of our code. So I'm going to comment out the part for function, and then I'm going to comment this out. So I have a function here called def add to number. So it's going to take a parameter called int, and it's going to return an int because it's just going to take the number and add 2 to it, and then so the output is going to be int. So this is how you specify type annotations in a function. So the parameter, which is just the same way we apply to naming a variable. So the parameter colon the type space and then the type, and then for the return type you can specify this is going to be the return type. So for the return type you close the parenthesis, space, and then an arrow, hyphen, and then the less than sign, I believe, and then space, and then integer, and then the return type, and then a colon. You define the function as usual. So this is the return type, this is the parameter type. Okay, so we are going to expect so even if I hover on this one, you can see that Visual Studio Code even understands type notations in Python. It can tell us that we're going to take a number of type int and you're going to return int. So even if I hover over here, you can see we are going to have that. So even Visual Studio Code assists with the type notations. Okay, so now that we have that, we can go ahead and actually check our code. So I'm going to you can also read the other one. So this is going to be of type it's going to take an integer and it's going to return a float. The reason why it's going to return a float is because an int plus a float returns a float, equals to a float. That's why we're going to return a float. Again, I have this global variable, so a is of type int, and it's going to be 40. And then you're saying you're going to take in a variable called a variable of type float, and you're going to return none because you're just going to increment the global variable. You're not going to return anything, and for that you can just use call the function and then print out a. So I'm just going to check if I have followed all the type annotations. So for example, to check that, I can first run my program using normal Python, and you can see I got back those results which are correct. So now I can also check if I have followed the naming convention that I have specified. So I can say Mypy and then the name of my file. I'm going to run that. So you can see incompatible types in assignment. Expression has type float, var but has type int. So let's check. This is on line 22. Let's check where the error is. So we can see on line 20. Let me just check again. That's on line 24. So on line 24 we are saying this, right? You're going to assign it you're going to return a type of none. So you're going to take float and you're going to add it, and you're simply going to return a. So this is going to be a is going to store int, right? It's going to store int variable, but after adding to this to it becomes float. So one way to solve this is that making this to be int. You can see how the type annotations help. So we are going to expect an int. So now if I run check my type conventions right now, this should also give us an error because argument 1 increment has incompatible type float, expected an integer. This is because I said here that I'm supposed to pass in int, but down here I'm passing in a float. So to fix that, I'm going to make that to be an int. So I'm going to run this again. Now you can see we have no issues, and we have adhered to all our type conventions that we have specified. So that's how type annotations can help in functions. So for example, let's say that you're not going to return anything, right? You're not going to return anything. So the Python has introduced a module called typing. So I'm just going to I'm going to import a library called typing. So I'm going to say from typing import no return. So no return is going to, instead of saying none, we're going to say no return, means it's not going to return anything. So we can replace none with no return. We can save this, and then we can go to our Mypy and try to run. We have an error, explicit return type in function which does not return. So on line 24, implicit return in function which does not return. So we have an error there. So you can see we are saying this function doesn't return, but you're specifying in here to return. So one of the ways to solve it is to leave it to none. I find this to be confusing a bit because I mean, no return, we should be able to return nothing, but if you try it out, it doesn't really work. I don't know why. So one of the things that you can also use is just use any. So we can also import any from here. So I just pass in here any, and I also pass in any. So we're going to be returning anything. Now you're not going to be returning, and you're not returning anything. So I think this should also give us an error, but let's find out. So I'm just going to go to Mypy, run it again. Okay, it didn't give us an error, it worked. Okay. So it's a bit confusing if because it's very new concept in Python. So just try it out and see what works for you. The return type for me example, it doesn't work, but if I use any works. So any means can be anything. So for example, if I replace this with any, I can pass in any value, I can pass in an int, I can pass in anything I want. It's just like having no type hints at all, right? Because any can be anything, and you can see it, we have no errors, we have followed all our type hints. So yeah, that's all about any and no return. So about no return, I really don't understand how it works, and documentation is not really clear on this. So you guys, if anyone understands how it works, please leave a comment in the comment section below. It will be really helpful for us who don't actually understand how it works. So I'm going to comment out the rest here, and I'm going to scroll down to var type. Okay, so they have introduced a class called var type. So var type will allow you to define your own types. So you need to import this again from typing. So from typing, this is going to be typing. I'm going to import type var. So type var will allow us to create our own type. So how you create your own type is that you specify a variable, you assign to a variable, and then you say var type. The name of it goes here, so you can see the name of it goes here. So the name, I could call it anything you want, but I just call it t. By convention, we call it the name that we're going to, the variable name that you're going to store it in. So I'm going to call it t, and these are the constraints. So if I hover here, you can see we have the constraints. Okay, so it also takes in the constraints. So the constraints are the types that is limited to, meaning that this, whenever I say parameter of type t, meaning that this parameter can only be the constraints that I provided here. It means it can be int and float. It can be any value outside of int and float. So that's what the type does. So for I said int, float, I say sorry, t is a type var, a variable type, and it's going to store int. Is constrained to int and float, meaning that it can only store int and float. So if I call function t, I have to pass in either an int or a float. I can pass in any value that I didn't specify, any type that I didn't specify here. Again, if you run this with the normal Python, even if you break the type hints, the normal Python interpreter is still work fine, because at the core Python is a dynamic language. That's why we're going to test it using Mypy to tell us in case you have violated any of the type hints. So I can call this function right now, and then I can pass in a value. So I can call it, let me just print it out. I'm going to call func t, and I'm simply going to pass in a value here. So I can pass in either int or a float. So I'm going to pass in here 20. So I can go and try to check the type hint. So go back to the terminal, clear this, and then try to write Mypy again. We have an issue there. So you do not define s and r. Okay, let me comment out these other functions for now. I will come back to them just in a second. So let me just go back and then try to run it. You can see we have no issues, because in here in here you provided in int, and then if I also specify in here provide in here a float, it should also work, because t is constrained to either int or a float. Okay, so I'm going to come back here and then try to run it again. I do not violate any of those convention of the types. Okay, so now we can also create our own other types. Let me just create this together. So we're going to type var, and I'm going to call it s, and then I'm going to assign it to string or bytes. So I'm going to call it bytes. So I can pass in here. So this variable s is constrained to strings or bytes. So down here I can uncomment this, and then I can call this function. I can print it out, and I can pass in here func s, and then I can pass in here either a string or a byte. So I can say hello world. So just like that. Let me just comment this guy out. So bring back. So you can see that we're taking in s, and you're simply going to return s. So we're going to take in a parameter of type s, and type s is constrained to string or byte. So then you're going to return the same type. Okay, so you're going to take in a string or a byte, and you're going to return a string or a byte. So let's go back to our terminal, run it again, and then we have no issues there. So we can also pass in here a byte. So I think for a byte there is a b in front of it. I really don't remember, but let's try it out and then let's see. Yeah, that's how we specify a byte in Python, so it also works. So this one can take in as a string or a byte, because you have specified it to a string or a byte. So I'm going to comment out these guys, and then now we need to create a type hint for q, for a var type of q. So I'm going to call it q, and then this is going to be of type var, and then they are by capital letters by conventions. Then we can say this one can be for q, we can specify q to be anything you want. So now let me tell you one thing about q. So about type hint, so if you specify the limits, right, I mean the constraint, then it will be constraint. But if you just specify it like this without specifying the constraint, then it can be of any other type. So that's what it does. So for example, if I come down here, I can pass in anything because I didn't specify any constraint. So if I call function q, I can pass in a string. I can say hello world, this is world, hello world, and if I run this, check it in Mypy, it should be no issue. And then if I come back here and change this to be of type int, maybe I specify in here 34, and I check it again in Mypy, it should still work without any issues because we didn't specify the constraint for that q. Okay, so if you didn't specify a constraint, then any value, any type can be passed in here. It's the same as not having type hints at all, right? Yeah. So again, also one thing here is that you cannot specify just one constraint. So you can specify, example, you can specify just sorry, let me get that right. So str, you can just specify one constraint. Like you can see, it gives you an error. Object blah, 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 single constraint to variable is not allowed. So you can pass in a single constraint. The reason why being is that why just passing qi, you can just say str if that's what you want to do, right? So that's why they do not allow a single constraint here. Again, but if you want to use type var for that, you can just say str. So at the time it's either str or str, which boils down to just str, a string. So if you run this, it should also work fine. Okay, but in this case we'll get an error because we're expecting a string, but if we're providing we are providing an integer. So if I check this, we should get an error, and you can see int cannot be int. Okay, yeah, so that's all about type var. So they're very important and they're very commonly used. So now let's go to iterables. So let me just go down here and then I uncomment this guy out. So we have this one for list, and then for list we need to import, this is actually comment. So for list we actually need to import a class called list. So from typing, so you say from typing import, we need to import list. So we're going to import list, and you're going to specify the list of integers. So we are saying a parameter function list takes in a parameter, and the parameter is of type list. But what do we want inside of the list? We want only integers, and we're simply going to return integer because we're going to return the sum of the content of the list. Since each content in the list is going to be list, is going to be an int, then the sum of it is also going to be an int, right? So that's why I'm returning an integer. So if I just call this function right now down here, I can print the result out. I can do a func list, and I can pass in a list. So I can pass in a list of integers. So I can pass in 4, 5, 6, and 7. So if I go back to Mypy and try to run to check this file, if I run this, you can see we have no type issues. So if I come down here and change this to be 6.7, and then I check the type hints, it's going to be an error because we have passed in a float while we're expecting an integer. So that is an issue right there. So we can see we have that issue right there. So now this issue, we can also specify here to be float, and then we can return float also here because floats plus floats will be floats, right? I hope you get the point there. So now what if maybe I want a list of either ints or floats, right? Because at the end of the day also integers can be classified as floats, right? So one thing you can do is you can use type var, and you can use type var. Let me just copy the one for t here. You can see we have type var t, right? And it takes in an int and a float. So let me just comment this out because later on in the code we don't want it to be conflicting, because you can define those type hints twice, they are var type twice. Okay, so just close this. So you can see we have a var type up here, and its name is going to be t. It takes in an int and a float. So we're going to specify, we're taking a parameter that takes in a list of t. Now t is constrained to either int or a float. So whatever we pass inside of our string must be an int or a float, and the result must be of type t, which can be either int or a float, because if you pass in int, a combination of int and float, it can either be an integer, the sum can either be an integer or a float, right? So that's why I did that. So if I go ahead and actually call this, run Mypy on this, we should have no issues. So if I run Mypy, you see we can have no issues, and I can also run this with the normal Python. We get back 3.8, 18.3, 18.9. Okay. So that's for type hints. So I can also have type hints that can this one can take in all ints, because it can either takes in int or a float. So if I pass in all ints, it would also work, and this should just give us 18. So if I type it with Mypy, there will be no issue found. Yeah, so that's about that. So I'm just going to comment this out. So I'm going to scroll down, and then I'm going to go to let me just uncomment the one for the type var, which is this one. I'm going to uncomment it because I need it also here. So you can see I have this function down here, and then this function simply is just taking a parameter of type list, and the values are constrained to t, and t is either an int or a float. And then I'm simply going to return that thing. So if you want a list, you're taking a list and you're going to return the same element of the list, right? So let's say you're going to take a list, you're going to of either int and float, and you're going to add 2 to each of those elements. At the end of the day, you want to return the same list with the same type, so you can do this. So in this case, I'm just taking it and I'm returning back without doing any operations on it, but you can do your operations inside of this function. So if I go to Mypy and then check the type hint, we have no issues, and if I run this with the normal Python, we should also work fine. Okay, so we have that out of the way. We are done with list. So I'm just comment this out, and then let me copy this and bring it along as we go down. So we are going to go to the section of tuples. So I'm going to paste this type hint right here, and I'm going to go to this section of tuples, and I'm going to comment out these tuples. Okay, comment them out, and then I close this. So you can see now we're going to use a class called tuple, so we need to import it. So we're going to say let me import it above here. So we need to say from typing, this is typing, you're going to import tuple, just like that. So we're going to import tuple class. So we're going to create a type var, which is as usual, which is going to be limited to an int or a float, and we can see we have a function called functuple, takes in a parameter of tuple, and the parameter the tuple elements are constrained to t, and you're simply going to return t, which is just the sum of those tuples. So now I'm going to pass in a tuple, and remember that in Python, just by specifying this, that is not a tuple, that's an integer. So if it is a single element tuple, remember to keep the comma right there. This makes it a tuple. Okay, but if you just leave it out, then it will be considered as a string. So that's one tricky part of Python. So now that we have that there, we're going to pass in a tuple of t, which is going to be either an int or a float. But one tricky part of tuples is that tuples are not mutable, meaning that you can't change them once you create them. This means that we have to specify the type of the tuple. So in this case, you're taking only one t, which means either an int, either a single int or a single float. So I cannot, if I pass in another value, let's say 5, then this will give me an error. So if I go back to Mypy and then try to run it, you see I get back an error. You see we have passed in tuple int, expected tuple int, we expected only one int. So to solve that, I just remove this and I can run it again. So now there'll be no issues. So now that's it. So if I want 2 tuples, so then it's simple, just add 2, and then you can pass in here 5. Yeah, and you can make it say 5 or 5.5 because this is either an int or a float. So if I run this, this should not give me any errors. So I can clear the terminal, run that again. You see we don't have any errors. So what if I want an infinite? So now that's very easy to do. So to do that, you just have to say comma and then ellipsis. That's all mean that you can provide in an infinite amount of things. 0.899, and then that should also work. So I can just go to terminal and then try to write Mypy, and then you can see we have no errors there. Yeah, so you can also use here the normal type. So you can specify int, and then all of the values can follow must be int. So let's try to see this, if this is going to work. So this gives us an error. We're setting int, and then you have got int. We're supposed to get all of them to be int, but we got int float. So we don't want that. So what we can do is that we have to remove this. So yeah, so if you want only floats, if you use the basic type, then all of the elements out of the tuple must be the basic type. But that's why if you want int and float, it's better just to create your own var type, and you can use that one. So you can already see the importance of var type. So I'm just going to change this back to var type, so I can define that in there. So our code now should work fine. So let me just run that, and you have no issues. So you can also run this in the normal Python interpreter, and then it works. So now that we have that, let's go back to dictionaries. So for dictionaries, we can create dictionaries, dictionaries in different ways. So there is a class called typedict, and we need to import that from typing, and then we can also import dict, and we can create a dictionary like this. So it's a bit training offside for now, but let's just proceed. So you can see yeah, hello guys, welcome back. So I had to pause the video a bit because it was a bit raining outside. You couldn't hear much, but now at least it has stopped raining. So let's continue with where we left from. We are talking about dictionary, how you can create a type hint for dictionary. So we're going to define a type var, and its name is going to be type. It's going to copy. Its name is going to be t. It's going to be constrained by constrained to int and float, and then we can import from typing. You're going to be importing type dict and also dict. So for type dict, there are two ways you can create this. The first one is using the object-oriented way. The second one is just using the functional programming way. So the object-oriented way is that you create a class called whatever I call it, and then it's going to inherit from my type dict, and then you can specify the attributes. So we're going to say name is going to be of type int, the height is going to be of type float, the name is going to be of type str. So you can specify the name here, the age is going to be of int, the height can be of float, and then the name can be of type string. So you have defined all it here. So if anyone doesn't follow this name convention, then Mypy should give us an error. So if I run this right now, run Mypy, Python is going to work fine, but if I run Mypy, okay, it works. So let's see why it works. So height can be of type float, but I specified an integer. I think by basically all ints can be floats, right? So if we change this to be int, and then we specify here floats for, let's say, 8.5, and then I'm going to save this and go back to my terminal and try to run this. Now we get back an error. That's the error, the issue for that error. So the issue for that error, the fix for it is just by taking 5 to 6, and then we can change this, run the code again, clear the terminal, run the code again. We got back an error, float expected of type int, because we didn't change it also here. So you need to also specify here to be float, right? So now we have that fixed, and this can be float. So yeah, so that's how you can do it the object-oriented way. Now to do the same thing by using the non-object-oriented way is that you import from typing, we import dict, and then you can create a variable here. It's going to, I call it person. It's going to be of type dict, and then the keys, right? The keys are going to be string, and all the values are going to be integer. So I'm going to have a person called the key is going to be name, which is of type string, and then the value is going to be also be string, which is going to be of type also of type of string. But if you can see I have followed this naming convention. So if I run the code right now, Mypy should not complain. And if I bring back to Visual Studio Code and change this to be an integer, right, save this and then go back to the terminal, try to run this, we can see we have that error, incompatible type string str expected a string. So this should be a string. So you can see how you can define those and then run the Mypy before running the code, just to make sure that all the type hints have been adhered to. So yeah, that's it for the type hints. I'm going to copy that's it for dictionaries. I'm going to go down, and then you're going to explain another called union. So union is just very similar to type hint for var type. So I'm going to paste in here the var type that you have been working with called t. So we also need to import union. So from typing, you're going to import a class called union, and then you're going to specify in here I'm going to call it u is equals to union. It has this limit. So type I said the limits are int, sorry, the limits are int or float, which is just this t, and then str. So this is the same as saying union and then int and then float and then str. So what this union does is that it allows any of those values that you have provided. So whenever I pass in a value, it can either be one of these that I have provided. So I can pass in u, and then I'm going to take a parameter called I'm going to pass in something called I have a function called func union. Is going to take in a parameter called it's going to take in a parameter called param, and then it's going to be of type u. It's going to return again return type u. So this type can either be a list, can either be of type t, int or float, or can be a string, right? So you can also change this to be int or float if you want. So if I run the code right now, we shouldn't have any errors. So let me just go back to Mypy and then try to run. We don't have any issues. So we have adhered to all the types. So if I change this to be something that is not maybe let's say I make this to be byte. Let me just make a byte here, and I can call it hello. So now this is going to be an issue because byte is not specified within our union. Okay, so if I run this again and I run this, we can see it also works. So a byte, I think byte can be classified as a string type. That's why I think it worked. So let's try to remove this str, remove it out, and then let's try to make to run our code again to see now it also works. So let's see why it's working. So func2 union. Okay, so here it is. So fun2 takes a parameter of type u, and it's going to return u. So the limit is going to be either an int type t, and type t takes an int or a float. But if I pass in a byte, it still works. So that's a bit strange. So let's try to remove this byte, and then let's keep it string. Make sure I save that, and then I move back to Mypy, try to run it. It still has no issues with that, so it still works. So strangely it works even if I specify t and d. So let's try to specify str and int. Let's see what will happen. Just explicitly specifying str and int, it also works. So now let me go back and specify, remove the string to be float. Okay, now let's see if it will work. So let's see. Now you have an error. The func has incompatible str expected if int or a float. So that's how union works. So union expects either of those. So I don't know why the previous part it was giving us that it was allowing even a string or a byte. So I don't know why that was happening. Maybe it has something to do with something how it works in the background, but you can see how it works. So if I remove this now and I specify in here an actual int, then that error should go away. So I'm going to clear the terminal, try to run this. That error should now go away, and I can also specify a float, and it should also work fine. So you can specify in here a float which can be 3.7, and then you can check again with Mypy, and then it also works. So now we have that. We have also another thing called we have defined another union called w, and it's simply going to take in either a list of ints or a list of floats, and then t, and then a float. So it can either take in any of these values that you can pass in. So you can pass in a list of integers, or a list of floats, or an int or a float. Now one way to do this is that instead of repeating this part, we can just use t, since t can either take in an int or a float. So you can have just one list, but in here we can replace that with t, and that should also work. But that if I try to run this right now, I comment out these other guys, and then I try to check with my Mypy, and then let's see if it will work. So this shouldn't, yeah, it works. So it works fine. So now we can also change this to be we can change the list here to be of type let me make sure I remove that properly, and then I can change this to be of type t, since t takes in either a list of integers or floats. So I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to paste it here, and then this can be 5.7, and then we can check out with Mypy again, and then we can see we have no issues right there. So if I change this to be a string, then this should be an error, because in our union we don't specify a string. So if I say hello world, and I can save that, go back to Mypy, and then try to run. Now we should let's see, it doesn't give us an error. Why? We said union the w of w, right? Function 2w, it takes in either a list of int, a union, or a float. So if I specify in here a string, it also works strangely. So let's check again. It also works. So I don't know why that also works, but in theory it shouldn't work, or maybe it's something to do with something how it works in the background. So yeah, but if I remove, let me try to remove this list. Let me say list of int, and then let me just undo this and return it back there, and then I'm going to copy this, paste it here, and then change this to be a string. So I'm going to say hello world, then I close this. So hello world. So if I save this and then I try to run it in the terminal, let's see how we got back an error, because a list is union expected a list of int, a list of float, or an int, or an integer or a float, but we passed in an str. We passed in an str, and this, it considers this to be an object. So all of this is considered to be an object. So for some reason, yeah, and that's how it works in Python. So if you specify a string inside of a list, it becomes an object. So in Python, everything is an object basically, right? So yeah, so now that you have looked at union, let's look at another class from the typing, which is called the typing mode, which is called optional. So optional helps us to have optional values, right, just as the name suggests. So for example, the optional is the same as, very similar to union, is the same as x or none. So it either return x or none, so it's the same as optional. So optional, if you provide in x, then it will return x, else it will return none. So that's the syntax for it. You can say we have a function called optional, takes in a type of optional, which is going to be an optional int, or is going to default to none. You're simply going to return that optional. So that's all there is to it. So if I check this in Mypy again, I'm going to clear the terminal, run this with Mypy. We see we don't have any issues right there. So that's all there is to optional. It's just union, where we have one class or none. So that's all there is to optional. So let's scroll down here, and then we have this one called generic. So I'm going to uncomment this guy out. So we can see we have generic. We have generic here. You need to import from type. We need to import generic. Now generic is mostly used with classes. So when you're creating a class and you need to define your own types, you use generic and you inherit from that generic class. Okay, so I can define, I have a type variable here called r, and I limit it to string, right? I told you that you can specify just one, so I limited it to string. And then, or you can just provide it in here string. I think it should just be fine. So I have a constructor here, just takes the name of type r, which is going to be a string, or must be a string, right? And then it's simply going to assign the name to self.name, and then we're going to create an instance of it called generic, and then we're going to print that out. So if I check this in Mypy, then there should be no error with this, and I can also run this in Python. We get back generic. So that's it for this tutorial. It has been a long tutorial, but I hope you guys are now clear and understand what type hints in Python are, the importance, and how to use it when it comes to new libraries like FastAPI, where the generics the optionals type hints are implemented. For example, you can see the optional here. So this is going to take a string, or it's going to default to none. So being able to understand type hint, you can be able to understand how to read code like this from modern Python frameworks, which are now implementing type hint. So yeah guys, thanks for watching. If you like this tutorial, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos like this. So thanks for watching. Keep safe. See you in the next one.